So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay, and this is actually a replay I was given very early on into the new patch being made public, and it's one that I completely missed. There was another instance of a Rivendell battle that I was sent, but that one was probably a little bit too far apart in terms of the theme and also the ultimate result of the battle. This one, however, is a little bit more like it. We have far more players, which Rivendell is a rather large map. The old version of Rivendell, well, this is an update which happened fairly early on into the development of this version of the game, because the old version of Rivendell was tricky to play on and also not particularly interesting. It was effectively this part of the map only. But it has now been expanded out. There's a lot more open space, there's a lot more in terms of structures, and it's a much more dedicated siege now than it was. And it is going to be an elven triumvirate that are on the defence as well, so let's see how well they can defend Elrond's abode. And it is going to be an all-evil affair as well on the attack. Starting off then with the player who sent me this battle replay way back when. Sorry that it took me this long to get to it, I almost completely missed it actually. And that is Colonel Speaks 46, who's playing as the Orcs of the Misty Mountains. Always a welcome sight to your fellow attackers, I think, when you bring the Orcs of the Misty Mountains along, because you know that numbers, at least partially, are going to be catered for exclusively by a faction such as this. White-Orc Fearmongers are one of the more high-quality units that the Misty Mountains do have. And in terms of damage dealing and trying to keep the higher quality elves at bay a little bit, this is going to be their best tool for doing that. They do need to be careful of elven pikes and of course elven archers as well. But if they can get into melee with some of the scarier units of elven infantry, then that armour-piercing damage should do the trick against some of the more heavily armoured elves that they will be facing on the defence today. Some standard and upgraded goblin infantry, so the regular version and then the version that's got the armour upgrade. Obviously, in terms of individual quality, this isn't going to be the highest, but the numbers here, 253, very cheap as well, you know, very easy to afford the armour upgrade on them to give them that little bit of extra resilience in melee and from arrow fire, which is going to be very necessary against the elves, but mostly they're going to be here for their cheap cost and very high numbers, because they're going to get butchered en masse by the elves, so they are going to need these numbers, the Misty Mountains, but that is going to play into an overwhelming numbers advantage that the attackers surely have. Moria Spearguard made of slightly sterner stuff, a little bit more expensive, but also defensively far more adept, bigger shield value, better abilities in melee, in addition to having the standard advantages that spears tend to have, and no reduction in numbers either. So, you know, for that little bit extra cost, you do get a fair amount more unit for your money. But still, the combination of the two means that there are going to be a lot of goblins running around today. Also, an interesting unit to behold is going to be the Drake Broodlings, purely because they're a very unique kind of unit in the sense that they are these sort of living battering rams. They're kind of like chariot, cavalry, troll mix, like a three-way mix of the three units. They do get the anti-cavalry bonus inflicted against them, so you have to be careful, but as long as you keep them moving, they can be a real pain. And especially against lower mass factions like the elves, if you get them rolling, they can really be the sort of thing which can turn a battle in your favour, but you have to commit them at the right time, otherwise they will get butchered. Heavy Goblin Crossbows. I mean, Rivendell is a map that is open enough for the attacking skirmishers to get into a good position, and I think the Heavy Goblin Crossbows are among the most dangerous units that the attackers can actually bring to bear here, because if they do manage to get a few good volleys off into the elves, that's a huge amount of value they can secure, though it is worth saying that Elven Arrow Fire should be focusing down a unit such as this as quickly as they are able. A couple of units of them, in addition to some standard Goblin Archers, again trading back and forth. At long range is certainly not the purview of the Orcs of the Misty Mountains, but they can at least give it a go. And then of course we've got some Snaga Skirmishers. Cheap Javelin's always going to be worthwhile to bring when you're on the attack. And Trolls are one way in which you can actually deal damage to a faction like the Elves as well. Snow Trolls made of slightly sterner stuff, Cave Trolls, there are a few more of them. And then you also have the Troll Drummers to keep your basic Goblins in line, so quite a few high-end units actually, when you consider the Blackback Mountain Berserkers and Goblin Kingsguard are also here. The damage dealing and more defensive bodyguard units. So they've gone for their entry level and higher tier units without too many of their mid tiers. Here have the Misty Mountains. Moving on, we have Google Bobble, who's playing as Isengard. Several units of the Uruk-hai Raiders, which are effectively the same sort of thing as the Goblin Infantry of the Misty Mountains, only slightly better, but also slightly more expensive, so there is that to consider. And ultimately, when it comes to dealing with the elves, they're still going to have much the same sort of weaknesses and shortcomings. 1-to-1, it isn't going to be a particularly even fight, but fortunately for the Orcs, it isn't 1-for-1. We also have the Uruk-hai Pikemen. Last time we saw Isengard in action, they actually did not bring their pikes in a very rare turn of events. But here, especially against the elves, considering what they have in their favour. I'm not too surprised to see the Uruk-hai pikes. They can get situated. It's one way that they can at least equalise or possibly even push the elves back, even against superior units to themselves. And of course they've got, you know, decent values for pikes as well, so the armour won't be enough to stop some of the elven arrows, but it'll do better than the goblin ramshackle armour that they wear. Uruk-hai infantry as well, going to be important for the same sort of reasons. Good defensively, also not too inferior to the elves to the point where they won't be dealing any damage at all. They will be able to go toe-to-toe with some of those elven units because of the damage values they can also inflict, which are decent for a unit of line infantry, but they're also reasonably expensive, so you would expect that. More crossbows to deal with on this side of the river as well, so the elves are definitely going to have to try and focus down units such as this if they are at all able. A couple of units of the Uruk-hai crossbowmen, so that's a lot of damage. Potentially the ram has been brought, but there's no fortifications on Rivendell, so no need to utilise it. The Guards of Orthanc do have the defensive abilities, the armour and the shield, to actually be tricky for even some of the better elven archers to do damage against quickly, from the front at the very least. But in terms of their damage dealing potential, obviously they're going to struggle to deal damage to especially some of the stronger units of elves that are going to be on the field today. But again, they're going to be the solid core of the Isengard infantry advance when it begins. Trolls of the White Hand, individually speaking, are stronger than any of the Misty Mountains trolls we just spoke about. They've also got a big shield value, so actually if the elves do try to focus them down with arrow fire, they are the most resilient. But mainly they're going to be there for dealing that spike of damage when the need arises. And speaking of which, you also have the Uruk-hai Berserkers and the Naz-kai for those purposes as well. More of an armour-piercing slant on them, so rather depends on which elven faction they end up tackling, whether these units are going to be efficient or not, especially the Berserkers. But still, big damage values, scary units for Isengard, and that is where the damage spike in their infantry does come from. Now then, moving across to the third army, we have Mordor, played by S.R. Jackson. Uruk archers on the front, so Mordor, probably of all of the Orcish factions, are most equipped for getting into sort of an elongated skirmish fight with the enemy, but against the elves that's probably not true even of them. They do have the ability to deal damage, but not so much with these Uruk archers, but it is still worth bringing them because it does put a little bit of pressure on the elven units, especially if you can focus down some of the more vulnerable ones and maybe don't get involved in an archer slinging match with them. But a couple of units of them. Orc fodder, who are pushing up the ram, but again that's not necessary unless you want to use it to try and sort of part the units a little bit, but that does come with its own risks. The orc fodder, of course, easy prey for the elves, but again, the numbers are the main thing that you would remark upon for the attackers as a whole here. The Olag-hai, who are more aggressively orientated than the Isengard trolls, and all around, in my opinion, the strongest unit of trolls that the game has to offer. Big damage, and the elves want to deal with them as quickly as possible because they are capable of doing a fair amount of damage even to higher end elven units if left to their own devices, so you have to try and overwhelm them quickly. Morgul Chosen, a strong unit of defensive spears, not dissimilar to the Guards of Orthanc we saw from Isengard. Yeah, obviously big armour values, more numerous, not quite as strong individually as those Guards of Orthanc, but they will do the same sort of job, being that block of armour and defensive ability in the middle of the Mordor army as they move forward, which, you know, will mitigate some of the extreme spikes of damage that the elves are capable of chucking out. Uruk halberds, useful for the same sort of reason as the White Uruk fearmongers, albeit to a slightly lower tier. But there are a lot of them, and if you do want a phalanx unit as Mordor, this is your only option, so it's not too surprising to see Mordor bring them. It's one of the ways in which you can try and keep those higher quality units at bay, but also vulnerable to the strong elven pikes and the strong elven skirmishers. Also true, well, that is true of the Orc Maulers as well. One unit getting the armour upgrade, so that's a sign that he's used all of his money. The fact that one of the units has got an armour upgrade and the other one hasn't, but they will still do much of the same job. Bit of armour-piercing bite, but again, low melee defense and no shield means that all of the elven damage dealers will be licking their lips at the prospect of facing this unit. And then we have some Uruk infantry, more standard fare, again similar to the Uruk-hai raiders and the goblin infantry. But this is a unit which I would say is on a slightly higher level than that because it blends into Mordor's roster maybe a little bit better and is a little bit more important to them, whereas Isengard tend to go for the higher tier and Misty Mountains just go for sheer quantity. Temple Guard, so the armour-piercing arrows, this is where Mordor can do damage to the elves from afar with some of their scarier units of archers. The armour-piercing missiles will be the sort of thing that the elves will want to shut down as quickly as possible if they're able, because they can deal similar sorts of damage to the crossbows, only they have some of, well, fewer of the weaknesses. Nazgul, obviously very, very potent in terms of their stats if they can embed themselves into the numerous orcs in front of them. And even the elves don't have something which is going to be on the same level stats-wise as them. The shadow bows are also hidden in there as well. The Mordor rangers and the orc javelins, so more cheap javelins, and the troll catapult, interestingly enough. So again, the more open nature of Rivendell from the front does lend itself to attacking skirmishers and artillery being a little bit more user-friendly, but there is always the element of chance when it comes to that sort of unit. And finally, we have Mevin, who's playing as Angmar. So Angmar obviously very well known for their abilities on the attack because of how resilient they can be. The Gundabad Guard and the Guardians of Kharndoom that we saw over here with the armour upgrade going to be forming the backbone of the initial advance, I would imagine. Also the Witchround Blackguard, which are a very strong unit of line infantry. Very good defensively, which is not out of the ordinary for Angmar. Angmar Marauders, the standard infantry that we've seen from all of the Orcish factions so far, 253 and relatively cheap, but closer I would suggest in terms of their abilities. You know, they're a bit better at dealing damage than some of the others, but you know, the defensive score is maybe a little bit lacking in comparison to some of the other factions. Angmar Halberds, very similar to the Uruk Halberds, and then we also have some of the Witchrealm Scourge Raiders for those throwing axes. Could be a couple of other units in there as well. I'd be interested to see if the dreaded witches are around, because they could get very easy value against the elves if they're used to good effect, so the elves will need to be on the lookout for them, most certainly. Now then, moving on to the defenders, we have Dennis Dobai, who's going to be playing as Lindon from the front here. So Lindon not going to be too vulnerable to armour piercing at all, and they're going to have that defensive skill, but they're also going to be a little bit more vulnerable to enemy skirmishing, but there's not a huge amount of that from the attackers today, so they should be in a good place. Lindar Bowman will be dealing damage from afar. The pike presence of Lindon is going to be one of the most useful things here, because they can most easily mass pikes among all of the elves, and the Mithlon pikemen are a very good example of that. We've got the Harlinden infantry back here as well. Against some of the standard orcs, like all of the elves are going to be very dominant against the orcs in melee, 1-to-1. It's just going to be a case of whether they can keep their lines shape. Lindon especially have a tendency to be a little bit lightweight in that regard, so going to have to be on the lookout for any sort of mass pushing. 3 units of them. Some of the bulkier units of Lindon are here as well, the Noldorin Guard, unsurprisingly. This is where they do dip into some very high armour values, but also the stats on these guys are very, very impressive, and if they're facing off against Mordor and Angmar, they will need that sort of thing in order to be able to weather the storm that's coming their way. In addition, Mithlond Marines, good in melee, but the main attraction is going to be the damage they can do with their javelins, first and foremost. A couple of units of them, a couple more units of the Mithlond pikemen as well, so some of the regular units on the front. More Lindar Bowmen backing up those units from the front. More Noldorin Guard. I mean, going into the red limit on the Noldorin Guard, but 3v4, you know, they're going to have a numbers advantage, and the Noldorin are ultimately a little bit more sturdy, so it's not terribly surprising. And then you have the Noldorin Blade Masters as well, the strongest unit of dedicated infantry that Lindon have at their disposal. Some Wands of Alos Tyrian in the background as well, damaging Elven Rangers. We have Remy, who is going to be playing as the Elves of Imladris. 2 units of the Eldarenway Archers, they're going to be a little bit more up to the task in melee in comparison to the Lindon Archers that we saw. Maybe not, you know, the Mithlond Marines are fine in melee, but these guys, it's kind of understood that with a unit of this cost, you're going to want to have expertise up close as well as from afar. 2 units of them going to be dealing damage to the enemy on the approach. Spears of Rivendell, in addition to the upgraded Imladris Guardians, making up the initial front line over here, so both of the High Elven factions weaving in with one another, but it's mostly Lindon guarding the initial approach, and then Imladris will be moving in as reinforcements by the look of it. Spears of Rivendell, Mithlond Swordmasters for a bit of extra damage as well. Just in over here we've got the Riders of the Broinen, who are very much fighting on home turf. No armour upgrade, but not necessarily needed. I mean, you know, if Horse Archers in this sort of situation, it does mean you can flip back and forth between the front lines a little bit more easily, because Rivendell is quite big. But that's the only reason I can think of to bring Horse Archers when you're defending backs to the wall like this. We have the Gwythi Arthand, in addition to the Eldarenway Spearmen. Imladris' high-end spears are very, very resilient, very tough to kill, and that will be an important trait of theirs when it comes to trying to outlast all of the orcs at their gates. You know, the Eldarenway spears, the damage that Imladris chuck out, also impressive. 2 units of the Eldarenway Swordmasters. The Imladris Guardians, a fantastic unit of all-round infantry, especially when you upgrade their armour like that. The God Helim, who do not have the armour upgrade here, but not strictly necessary for a unit like this. The Silverthorns are always an interesting pick. Could be an interesting one if they manage to get the Temple Guard in there for sights, but very good at range, very good at melee, as you would expect. A couple more units of the Mithlond Swordmasters. There are some Norituno warriors in attendance as well. And the third Elven faction is Bacon Soup, who's going to be playing as Lothlorien, the Ballista over here, so if they can get into a good position with that, they could do some horrendous damage to the orcs. we've got the Galathrim Axemen and the Lorien Bladesmen, more standard fare. The Bladesmen, but the Axemen very impressive. Lothlorien very good at dealing damage up close, and that will be a useful trait as well to try and thin the amount of orcs that are coming their way quickly, and they're going to be guarding this approach mainly, you would think. So the Cairn Amroth Rangers, all Elven Rangers are really, really damaging, and that's going to be important as well. If they target down the right sort of things, not a huge amount you can do against the very high missile damage they possess. More Lorien Bladesmen, so going for some more of the regular units to try and pad the numbers. 2 units of Cairn Amroth Rangers is big. You've got the stakes here, but not going to be terribly important, but you don't know what the enemy are bringing, so it is always worth having them in the back pocket. I don't actually know what Drake Broodlings do if they go careening through stakes. I think they break them. But yeah, Lorien Archers, there's several speed bumps for them to get over in that regard if they don't, so maybe don't go this way if you're them. Galathrim Archers up on the hill, more Galathrim Axemen, so there is another route you can take to get around and gain the high ground as the attackers if you go this way, but Lorien have got a huge amount of their own skirmishers up here, and indeed the vast bulk of their strength up here, so they're very keen on that not happening. Galathrim Warriors with their up-close armour piercing, and then you also have the Caras Galadon's Guardians, the Pikes with multiple HP, and Galathrim Warriors in there as well. And then over here, of course, the Kindred of Celeborn and the Galathrim Nobles, very, very high-end units indeed. The Throwing Axes, one of the very best units of Throwing Axes in the game. They and probably the Dragon Slayer's Trackers from Erebor are the only two that would contest that with gusto, but we'll have to wait and see on that. Galathrim Nobles as well, more Silverthorn Arrows, and also some more Noratuno Warriors up here as well. So I will be making a bit of a cut, because I would imagine that the Orcs are going to want to stack themselves up on the front before moving in. I'd be surprised if Isengard and Mordor get the party started early without Angmar and the Misty Mountains, and then we'll get this show on the road, because I think, well, it'll be interesting to see how the attackers actually decide to deal with this situation. I think for the defenders they have to be reactive, but again the slightly more open nature of Rivendell could make this one a little bit more of a dicey affair for the elves if they don't set themselves up properly right from the off. And for the attackers, they need to be very, very wary of the kind of damage that the elves can chuck out quickly, especially with the kind of units that they brought. But yes, I will rejoin when the first blows are being struck. There were a few errant catapult volleys before this, but it didn't actually hit anything. Indeed, all it really achieved was to force Lindon at least temporarily backwards a little bit, although they have moved forwards again, only to be met by the throwing axes of the Witchram Scourge Raiders. A little bit of a weird frame drop there. But the Scourge Raiders should do very nicely against Lindon as well. That high base damage should be exactly the sort of thing to help really hammer home their advantage against that lightweight armour. The Riders of the Broinen also moving forward to try and do a bit of counter skirmishing. I mean, the Witchram Scourge Raiders themselves do have at least a little bit of armour, but unupgraded as they are without their helms, they will still fall prey pretty quickly to sustained Elven arrow fire, which is perhaps why they're going to retreat now. You don't want to lose them too early in the battle after all. Throwing projectiles like that can be incredibly useful. You can also see over here starting to move forward the Uruk archers, but an occasional arrow from within the settlement starting to whiz over and hit the advancing orcs over on this side as well. You've got a little bit more of a variety of positions you can attack from over on this side if you are the orcs, whereas on the other side it's far more of a narrow cliffside approach, but it is still going to be important, I think, for the attackers that they make use of all three of their potential avenues of assault here. Noratuno Warriors, the ones utilising their ammunition early, which makes sense. Most entry-level Elven Archer, but also not half bad in melee for what they are. 2 different layers to the Lindon defence have already been set up as well, so future-proofing a little bit here. Lindon, I'm a little bit curious as to why the frames drop so heavily in and around these gates. I hope that the battle doesn't take place too much around these initial defensive points, otherwise we're going to have to put up with that. It's very clearly defined as to when that happens as well. Very peculiar indeed. Meanwhile, still not too much in the way of forward momentum just yet, and I suppose the orcs will be all too okay to see their most basic units attracting some of the elven projectiles, which could be far better put to use against something with a little bit more punch to it. Scourge Raiders were a worthy target, but orc fodder most assuredly not. Not even being forcibly pressured by the Uruk archers, although they are the target now. That superior elven range starting to come into play. And that infantry as well will be a concern over on the other side. Also got Colonel Speaks 46 moving forward, taking point with the Misty Mountains down the cliffside approach. It's also the small matter of the Elven Ballista, which is also firing, so they're certainly not being shy with their ammunition here, the Elves, but they do need to be a little bit careful that they don't end up wasting it. That one, I think, did indeed end up bisecting some of these units, but again, it's just Orc Maulers. The Scourge Raiders, not a terrible choice of target, but you're going to need that that artillery, I think, for a little bit later on. A little bit more understandable perhaps now if there's a little bit of back and forth with the skirmishers, just because the Uruk archers are now in position. A few of the arrows being flighted over and going after the unshielded spears of Rivendell. Yeah, I think it's around these structures here. Very weird cause for a frame drop there. Mithlon pikemen still there, but the Mithlon Marines also pulling back a little bit. I mean, to be honest, this area over here already well set up with a defence, and also the possibility of crossfire is a little bit easier over here, and I think that is what Lindon are going to be doing now. It's a little bit harder for them to dictate the pace of the engagement if they're too far away from their support, which is certainly what the case is at the moment. Again, any elf that they can fell from long range with their archers will be one that is celebrated among the attackers, even if it is some of the more basic ones such as this. The elves need all the manpower they can get if they are to hold on to these front lines. Imladris Guardians, higher tier unit, but also far more resilient against that kind of attention. Meanwhile, Goblin archers now also drawing the attention of some of the Lothlorien archers as the poison projectiles start to rain down. The Goblins also already tired, but a very, very cheap unit of archers. Again, the elves perhaps being coaxed into utilising their ammunition on the unworthy. Poison projectiles still coming down, and the cave troll drummers being close by means that the poison projectiles won't be enough to quickly rout the Goblin archers in the way that perhaps Lothlorien would have been hoping for. Banner carrier of the Goblin archers lagging behind a little bit, as the Moria Spear Guard are the ones that are going to be picking up the slack in infantry terms. Isengard and the Misty Mountains on this side, Angmar and Mordor on the other for the moment. A little bit of mixing and matching perhaps. I think the other side will probably require a little bit more manpower to try and really hammer home an advantage. The bridge over here, this bridge and the little bit beyond that the Goblin archers are occupying was the initial layout for Rivendell. The one part of the original map that does still remain. Orc slowly moving forward. The Ballista now with a greater variety of units to aim for, and indeed managing to kill off a lot of those Uruk-hai pikemen there. That's definitely worthwhile. Managing to get a couple of the Uruk-hai infantry in for the deal as well. If they can keep up that sort of pressure, actually the Temple Guard would have been there, but I think they are now moving their Ballista just a little bit. All chosen moving forward. Plenty of trolls, including actually the Misty Mountains trolls, the cave trolls moving over here, so there's a lot of upfront power here, including the snow trolls in and amongst things as well. So this may come down to how much brute force the orcs are going to be able to lay on in a short space of time. Moratino warriors still looping a few shots overhead. Ballista bolts raining down once again. Some of the units in behind are now in loose formation, but still some good hits. And this is just lighting a little bit of a fire under the attackers to let them know they don't have a limitless time to be able to set themselves up. They are going to need to pick and choose a good moment to move in. Meanwhile, Angmar Marauders moving forward. This is a well-prepared Lindon front line now, though. It's going to be that crossfire which is going to be the important thing, I think. Elder Enway archers and javelins in close proximity, including the Ballista, which maybe got a little bit too close. Now in range of the Uruk archers, and needless to say the Elven Ballista crew is not the most resilient. I can see what they want to do, set themselves up here and they can sideswipe Mordor as they move into the Lindon front line. Meanwhile, right in and amongst the area where the frame rate is at its weakest, but the Spears of Rivendell moving in try and put some pressure on the already somewhat depleted Orc fodder. Should be an easy win for them there. Uruk archers in close proximity, but not now able to get a decent shot off on the unshielded, lightly armoured elves. Mordor Chosen could move forwards as well. A little look over on this side, so surrendering a little bit of ground. Lothlorien archers moving backwards. The bridge will be traversed now, and indeed a decent amount of damage has been done to the elves of Lothlorien as well. But it is back here where the slightly more serious defensive effort can be put on. Slightly more easily, perhaps, defending the cliffside, but they can't afford to not defend the low ground either, because if they do, they'll give the orcs a straight shot to Rivendell's heart, and that would be not good for their allies over on the other side, who will have plenty to worry about over here anyway. Fodder really getting killed off very quickly, and the Morgul Chosen not arriving quickly enough to salvage that particular situation. The Snaga archers trying to do what damage they can to Lindon, which is a worthy cause. Even some of the shielded Lindon units are not going to be great under arrow fire, Ingard aside. Surely it's going to be over here where the elves are going to start to really do the business in terms of skirmishing javelins and flaming shot, enough to actually cause the Morgul Chosen to already become shaken momentarily. And they are one of the more resilient Mordor units, not only physically but mentally as well. I will say that some of the positioning of the skirmishers and how eager they are to utilise them is maybe a little bit too... they're a little bit too keen, perhaps. They're not really pacing themselves in terms of their skirmishing use. I mean, this unit of Morgul Chosen is moving forward here. They will get killed off pretty quickly as a result of this, but there's so much more where that came from. We need to try and spread the damage out a little bit. I'd argue that enough has already been done to this unit of Morgul Chosen to make them far less of a threat to the elven front line. And still that ballista, the classic medieval 2 thing of artillery spinning on the spot, well and truly in the sights of those Snaga archers now. Warriors pushing forwards a little bit more. I mean, this could be intentional from the attackers as well, the sense that they've set up and they know that the defenders are maybe being a little bit too eager with their skirmishers, so they're more accepting of taking a slightly slower approach. A unit of Morgul Chosen over on this side, Noratino warriors arriving, making this a relatively even fight, but less units being committed over on this approach for the time being. The elves will be reasonably happy with how things are going though. In melee, certainly their expertise, Uruk infantry moving forward, plenty of supporting units over here for the attackers as well, but the same can be said of the defenders. Imladris guardians in close proximity, and because of how relatively close the town centre is, the elves can more easily commit reinforcements should the need arise. Imladris, again, seeing the Temple Guard here, second hit point and the black Numenorian armour that they do wear is going to be enough for them to be able to soak up a fair amount of damage, but not limitless, especially not against the heightened damage that elves are capable of kicking out, and it is the Eldarenwe archers as well. So they will need to be retreated and utilised a little bit later on, perhaps. Mithlond Marines still firing away. I mean, much in the same way as the Noratino warriors, for the tier of unit that they are. Once they do run out of ammunition, they are very useful in melee as well, but those javelins are going to be a very key part of Lindon's efforts to keep the attackers at bay here. And good damage being done to the attackers, both from the artillery and from the javelins and archers, but just how much their ammunition supply can withstand throughout the course of the battle. Cave Troll drummers moving forward with the goblin archers shortly behind them. Again, it is a pretty intimidating sight, especially when you consider how much damage Lothlorien are capable of chucking out at range. It's the sort of approach which is going to do a lot of damage to the Misty Mountains and Isengard, but based on the setups of both of their armies, they should be able to withstand a fair amount of it. Isengard's forces still massing themselves up there. Snaga archers still firing away. Uruk-hai crossbows also doing their thing now. I mean, they really need to start moving this ballista out of harm's way. The importance of artillery cannot be understated, and I think he sees at this point what an error has been made, because the artillery crew is just being retreated, but that doesn't get away from the fact that the crossbows will be able to do damage to all of Lindon's infantry, including, of course, the mighty Lothlorien Guard, which is probably why we're seeing so many of them already slain on the front line. Not the sort of thing that Lindon would have been hoping to see. Just in behind the Mithlond Marines. Again, they can out-skirmish them if they move forward. It's the sort of situation where your hand is somewhat forced as well, because not using your archers to counteract this would be far worse for you in the long run, because you'll be losing so much of your good quality infantry as a result of what is transpiring. Still going quite well for the elves in this melee engagement, but I would argue this is slightly less important in the grand scheme of things. Those Olag High starting to waddle their way forwards as well, which will turn the tables in this engagement as well. And without the ballista over here, slightly more attractive proposition to move through now. Lindar Bowman looping the odd fire arrow over there, but that isn't going to be enough to cause any of these units to rout just there. Low tier they may be, but they are still far too healthy and with far too much support around them for the odd fire projectile to cause them to run for the hills. Those crossbow bolts still moving in, and they've already done a bit of a number on this admittedly pretty intimidating Lindon front line. It's well constructed if the enemy decide to try and engage you immediately, but that's not what the attackers are doing, and that is the wise course of action. We do have reinforcements further back, but I think they are going to need to use their archers in a little bit more of a willing manner than they have done thus far. Imladris do have a fair few units back over here as well. Slowly but surely, the attack over here could start getting underway as well. Lorien Bladesmen, I mean, the Goblin Archers sweeping ahead of their support maybe a little bit too far, and Lothlorien taking the opportunity to get rid of this pesky unit of goblins who have already been relatively well utilised by Colonel Speaks. They will be sent packing. Will probably just about get away without routing, and if the Lorien Bladesmen continue to chase, which they will, this may end up being a little bit of a concern. I mean, if they can bunch the goblins up, it could still be okay. All of the support coming in, that relatively depleted unit of Lorien archers that was active earlier on. Once again, opening up on the goblin advance, which includes far more in the way of infantry now, although the cave trolls will be undoing any of the good work that those poison arrows are attempting to do. That is a lot of units, however, stretching back unbroken pretty much to the entrance to the cliffside approach, so there'll be plenty of work for Lothlorien to get over or get through on this side of the settlement, all the while this side also going to be put under a decent amount of pressure. Mithlond Marines getting a little bit too far ahead of the rest of the front line perhaps, and again support of the reinforcements of the orcs going to be able to force those Mithlond Marines out of the way. Noratuno warriors doing their thing. Eldarenway archers doing the same. Looping their shots over. I mean, this now Mordor committing, or the orcs I should say, led by Mordor, committing several units of their trolls and not enough damage dealers over here for the elves. One unit of the Imladris Guardians was committed, but several units of trolls, and in conjunction with the hefty amount of infantry support they've got going on over here, I think the elves are probably trying to get away. Ironically, they're committing too much at range early on and not enough in melee. We'll see, their quality could be enough to salvage the day, and indeed Lindon going on the attack now, which is maybe a decision that could have been reached a little bit earlier, especially given how potent Lindon can be when up close and personal. As we've seen in several battles in the new patch, they performed very well across most of them. We'll see if that can be the case again here. And now actually it's Mordor and Angmar who are able to get a little bit of crossfire set up as more and more of the elves get committed forward. The Imladris Guardians are a very accomplished melee fighter. The problem is you need really high damage values to be able to deal with trolls quickly, and I mean this is a fairly rare sight. The Trolls of the White Hand, the Snow Trolls and the Olag High and the Cave Trolls are all of the attackers' trolls outside of drummers and artillery have been committed over here now. So it's a huge damage spike. In order to stop this, effectively you need the entire force, and I think the elves have been guilty of maybe dragging their heels a little bit. Eldarenway archers also getting targeted down by the armour-piercing arrows of the Temple Guard. And the Northuno warriors threading the needle. I mean, they're going to be able to... They're not able to pour in enough damage over here either, I don't think. They need more of their support forward. They need the Warns of Lothlorien firing, because, I mean, a lot of these units that are being held in reserve now, they're not going to get the opportunity to use them if their front line falls to pieces. Although there's still a long way in this battle to go. Witchhelm Scourge Raiders have tried to charge their way through, but they paid dearly for that. I mean, there are pikes here as well, which is probably part of the reason why. Needless to say, cavalry does not relish the opportunity to face off against pikes in pure melee. And in terms of pure melee over here as well, Lindon getting the better of this engagement now, but it's over on the other side where I'd be more concerned because of the presence of all of these trolls. More units now moving forward, the Spears of Rivendell doing so, Northuno warriors, Lindar bowmen opening up, just having a quick look over here. A huge column of infantry actually electing not to go across the bridges. Admittedly the pathfinding is a little bit awkward, but in so doing they are somewhat playing into Lothlorien's hands, because this is a very narrow passageway to try and progress a lot of attacking infantry, and especially when you consider the close proximity of a lot of these supporting units, it's going to be a very bloody affair for the attackers if this is indeed how they intend to go about their business for the long term in this battle. Bladesmen carrying out rangers as well. There's still reinforcements coming, but it's not a limitless amount. These Isengard forces are going to try and take the direct path. One thing I have noticed is still a lot of the elves have got quite a few of their units in the backfield in reserve, which is all well and good as long as you have a cause left to fight for come the late game. And when the trolls get committed in numbers like this, there's every chance that you may not have that luxury afforded to you. Though the Noldorin Guard have been doing the business against the orcs over on this side in conjunction with the rest of the Lindon infantry. Now the ballista once again opening up, Uruk archers bearing the brunt of that, but at least it's kills in quantity, which is the main thing I think the defenders need at this point in time. The more of that they can do, also the more likely it is to instigate some sort of mass rout. Need to be careful that they don't hit their own units, mind you. Forward come some of the slightly more potent units from Angmar, the Guardians of Khan Doom, which in the recent faction overview actually, I didn't realise that they actually have pretty decent attack scores as well. I mean, they are expensive as far as a line infantry unit goes, but I'd always thought, in the last patch, they were a pretty much entirely defensively focused unit, but now a little bit more well-rounded perhaps. Albeit in close proximity against Lindon, stuff like their armour and their shields will still not be enough to overcome that elven finesse, especially when the Noldorin Blade Masters are on this part of the line. But the problem is, they may end up getting crunched from behind by these trolls, which are now running amok through Rivendell's streets. And there's, I mean, sending over some infantry to deal with the situation would probably be the way to go. We've just about managed to salvage that ballista crew, which has been having a bit of a torrid time of it. They need some of their damage dealers over here, really. Warns of Lothlorien doing their thing, who did get pulled back as a result, again, of the attacking skirmishers being used to pretty good effect in this approach. And still the Olag high on the front line. Eldarenway Swordmasters will be significantly more worthy foes for the trolls. Javelins, attacking javelins this time though. Many of those missing the mark, but anyone that manages to hit and kill a Swordmaster will be worthy indeed. God Helene having to loop their arrows over a little bit. Lindar bowmen getting intercepted by the cave trolls as well. What was that now? Attacking artillery, the troll catapult managing to clear enough of a space to again get that crossfire off into an area where the defenders have been doing a lot of damage. I mean, they'll be doing a lot of damage here for Lindon, and they will also be doing a lot of damage over here against the Misty Mountains, which I think that was the Misty Mountains General, I believe. I don't think any of the Elven Generals were close by. So the Misty Mountains General falling by the wayside. Some of the Lothlorien Bladesmen actually in behind enemy lines as well, breaking up the Goblin advance. And it is over here where they're struggling the most. Fairly decent opening gambits from Colonel Speaks, but this was maybe a bit gung-ho. And Lothlorien will be all too happy to accept the kills that are coming their way now.
Only half the enemy force remains.
A few more loop shots from down low, however, from the Goblin Archers trying to do their thing. Lothlorien Bladesmen ready to defend the bridges just in case Isengard do elect to try and attack across them, which I think they should. A lot of the other Isengard forces now making their way across as well. I mean, I think Lothlorien are going to be victorious over here, though, if this keeps up, which means it is actually important for the attackers that they manage to maintain their advantage over here, which will only increase if they're able to do hideous damage to the elves, such as that. Good use of the catapult. I mean, that is the danger. It's the sort of thing which the defenders, I think, were intent on trying to utilise for themselves, but the attackers have probably taken greater advantage of this crossfire than they have. Albeit that was, again, a bit of damage to Lindon, but probably more friendly fire than anything else. Artillery ever the double-edged sword. The trolls, meanwhile, still going strong, the Olag High. The owls trying to do the business. Forward come the Drake Broodlings, who will be able to smash through this area, you would have thought. Galathrim Axeman going to be doing a lot of damage to the attackers. Oof. Again, the defending artillery also having its say, and that's a big rout as well. There's a lot of Orc Maulers that are running for the hills. Very back and forth. I mean, both sides have inflicted deep wounds on the enemy. It's just in this kind of battle, when you see the attackers time and again able to get in behind enemy lines and cause havoc like this, they tend to go on to win. But on the flip side of that, because it is the elves on the defence, they're capable of doing so much damage to the units that manage to get in behind that it's not necessarily a given that they will be able to make things stick. I mean, managing to get through again, but it's whether or not these Angmar Marauders can maintain themselves in the face of far superior units. Urukai crossbows, point blank shot from the ballista. I think finally the ballista's charmed existence is going to come to an end. Or are they going to be able to get away again? If they manage to remount the ballista again, that's crazy. Quite the Arthander in close proximity, so they'll be well defended. One snow troll remains. Oh, 0 snow trolls remain. 1 troll of the right hand, 0 trolls of the right hand, so again the elven damage managing to... No, it's fine. As I was saying, the elven damage has probably bailed them out of a situation here where many other factions probably would have fallen away, but their own low numbers may end up being a bit of a concern here, and as much as Lothlorien occupy a good position against Misty Mountains and some of the Isengard support over here, they can't just hold up on this cliffside because the town centre is further within the settlement, so they will have to leave their comfortable nest up here at some point. Otherwise the attackers will start to put more pressure on the town centre and open up that as a possible victory opportunity. White Rock Fearmongers doing their best to try and establish a beachhead up here, but surrounded, and some of the armour-piercing Lothlorien units will crack through the armour that they wear as well. Galathrim Archers, more Galathrim Axemen being siphoned off into the settlement. I mean, we saw one unit of them throwing their payload and now getting involved in melee as well. A little bit more damage focused than the Imladris equivalent, though not as able to withstand as much punishment. But I would argue here that probably doing damage quickly should be the main priority of the elves. If they're able to do the business in that regard, then they could shock the attackers into retreating, albeit there's still a lot of reinforcements ready to march their way forwards. Flaming shot being used. So definitely trying to utilise their morale breaking capabilities. The Gogheli in melee as well, a very resilient unit. Renway Spearmen arriving as well, so the Orcs have done good work so far, but there's still a ways in this battle to go. And our bowmen fighting hard in melee now, having already expended a decent amount of ammunition, but again facing down superior numbers, but still able to force the enemy back. More of the Lothlorien units are arriving piece by piece as they feel more comfortable against the Misty Mountains. That is most unfortunate for... That was the Lorien general, wasn't it? Very unfortunate considering the Galathrun warriors have only just arrived. The Gwaith the Arthand over here with the Galathrun warriors, a defensive and offensive unit together, whose Axemen will be vital if they're to turn back the armoured legions of Angmar from this position. And the Kindred of Celeborn using their projectiles as well. I mean, they'll rip through some of these rank and file units very quickly. They won't do too badly, even against the Guardians of Kharndoon upgraded armour from the front as well. I mean, as I said in the deployment phase, it really is between them and the Dragon Slayers Trackers of Erebor for who is the strongest throwing axe unit in the game, you would suggest, and the damage they can chuck out is so substantial. But consolidating their position over here, what little remains of the Noldorin Blade Masses and that initial Lindon front line is being cleaned up by the Orcs of Angmar and Mordor. Some Lindar Bowmen as well. It's interesting that the Troll Catapult was going for the standard shot, but the accurate fire has actually served them pretty well so far, but they may be needing a little bit of support on the front line. There's only one Olag High remaining, so the storm of the trolls has passed, but the legacy of the damage they've done remains. Trying to consolidate their position with pikes as well, which is a good idea. Try and keep that elven damage at arm's length. It's whether or not they're going to be able to get them in position or not. Orc javelins. Again, every javelin that hits is going to be a good thing for them. Uruk archers moving forward. There's still that column of Angmarim reinforcements still to be committed. So, while it isn't limitless, there's still a good amount to be committed yet. Keren Amroth Rangers, more Galathrun archers. I mean, quite a lot of the heavy hitters of Lothlorien have had to be committed to the main settlement at this point, so there is the possibility that if the Misty Mountains keep this up, they could start to force Lothlorien back, as they have to make do with less continually over here. But it has been a grisly attack that Colonel Speaks has had to put up with. More of the Isengard forces heading this way, putting pressure on the rear of the settlement, the Lorien Blazemen, I should say. Again, it's a relatively narrow position. There's not very many of them, but they are far superior to the Uruk-hai Raiders that are trying to effect an advance over here. There's also a unit of Galathrun Axemen should the need arise, because they can't afford for some sort of flanking force to start making headway through the settlement, especially not with the situation being what it is on the front line, where they're hanging on by a thread a little bit. Again, relying on that quality and that damage that the elves can chuck out, but it's just whether or not they have enough of that now to be able to deal with the sheer heft of these orcish armies. Kindred of Celeborn getting involved in melee, in addition to another dual wielder, the Wardens of Elos Tyrion, far more lightweight, but still everyone going to have to play their part in melee. Angmar Halberd's going to try and keep them a little bit further away with that phalanx formation. Gwaith the Arthand going to be difficult to bring down. They need more units over here, the elves, but I don't know whether they necessarily have them. There's a few of the Lorien units that managed to escape that frontline battle who can be recommitted now, but is it going to be enough? I'm not sure. Watch around Blackguard. Still the small matter of ever more reinforcements pouring forwards as well. Nazkai. So there's quality in addition to numbers. Galathrun nobles. Well, the Troll Catapult has finally been set alight, but the damage it did earlier on has already proven to be more than worthwhile. Now they can simply be thrown into melee to see what they can accomplish. I mean, the Orcs will probably win over here as long as they can try and circumvent that pike formation, or utilise that pike formation. Get the damage coming in from afar. Ardenheim shadow bows there as well. Orcs looking pretty good from the front here. All the Misty Mountains need to do is try and keep as much of Lothlorien pinned over here in the back end of the map as they possibly can. And then take it from there. Victory seems certain for the Bladesmen and the Warriors that Lothlorien still have committed over here, but it's just the movement that the Elves can now afford. Guardians of Caras Galadhon probably should have been moved off of this high ground earlier. They were never going to be much use way back here, which was one of the things I was a little bit concerned about in the deployment phase. The way that the Elves had set up was maybe trying to sequester too much away for a rainy day when the rainy day is right now and most of your worldly possessions have already been washed away. Easily able to hold the Misty Mountains at bay, but it's elsewhere where the problems
Our enemy has command of the castle.
are continuing to prove to be a problem. Uruk-hai Berserkers, another dangerous unit which has arrived on the front line now. I mean, the Orcs are not endless in number, but really now, huge, again, that column of Angmar units that we mentioned earlier, more regular Angmar units, the heavier Gundabad Guard. There's not really much that they're going to be able to do to stop this now. I think they're going to try and go after Lorien. Which makes sense, because if you can keep Lorien pinned back here, you could try and take the town centre, but ultimately, is there much point? If you manage to keep Lorien pinned on this high ground, you could then get away with only using one unit to take the town centre, and then the Elves are trapped. They can't get through all of your units. See if that's how things go. Again, the Guards of Orthanc, another good quality unit arriving, another very defensive unit that's going to be difficult even for the Elves to kill off quickly. Kai on the front line as well. I mean, the Gwaith Arthand are a very resilient unit indeed, but surrounded on all sides like this, and especially when one of the units is the Nazkai, which can do noticeable damage to them. Another Elven general skewered by the Uruk-hai pikemen. Velos Tyrion thinking defeat seems certain. The player admits defeat. And that's a bit of a shame from Imladris, that. I mean, to be fair, most of their units were mostly gone. These two units of Elder Enway Spearmen could have held these units back a little bit longer. Kindred of Celeborn now pretty much alone, fighting on the front line. As the Orcs continue to make their way through here. Galathrun Nobles again, they've still got ammunition, but they've waited too long to use it. A good amount of damage to the Angmarim as they climb up that hill. I mean, banking up on the high ground here, it would be sporting of the Orcs if they didn't try to take the town centre, because it would be their right to do so at this point. They've outmanoeuvred the Elves, but if they do go over and try and kill off Lothlorien the old-fashioned way, it does give the Elves a puncher's chance at still securing a win in this fight, because Lothlorien in a situation like this are very well fortified. Some of their units, though, that they would have liked to have saved, not going to be able to do so, which are Blackguard able to intercept the Galathrun Nobles. No more of the Silverthorn arrows will be fired, and it is entirely on Lorien at this point, because I mean, Lindon is so battered and bruised. They've got the occasional unit running around, but not much. This is the sum total of the Orcs, but it's a pretty hefty force still. Galathrun Warriors actually still in the town centre. A fair amount of this may also come down to, if they can kill off Moria in their entirety, they can consolidate their force a little bit more. Which they will be able to do, because I mean Moria, or the Misty Mountains I should say, really don't have all that much left. I mean, we are bearing down rapidly now on the final 10,000 frames. The final phase of this battle is going to be the Orcs trying to prise Lothlorien from the cliffside. Along, still those Karen Amroth Rangers. I wonder if they have any ammunition left. Even if they do they have the appropriate position to be able to utilise it. They've got a two-hander in melee as well, which is somewhat unique among rangers. The Angmar that were taking damage from those silver thorns from the side. I mean, the Galadon's Guardians are good, but I don't think they're so good that they're going to be able to overcome the might of the Orcish legions which still lay before them. Poison projectiles now being utilised as well to try and rout off some clumps of these Orcish forces. And the Galathrim Axemen, even though they're surrounded with that ranged support, still doing well, at least for now, although overwhelming force will be applied at some stage relatively soon, you would suggest. Still a few of the Lindon forces still fighting away as well. And yeah, they have to turn around at this point, the Galathrim nobles, lest they get finished off by these lowly Snaga. The rains continue to pour. Defeat a distinct possibility. They actually do outnumber the Blackguard a little bit, but that javelin support, Blackback Mountain Berserker, still a good quality unit as well. It looks like they are going to try and claim the town centre. Uruk-hai Berserkers have to mulch their way through the unresponsive Elder Enway. There we go. Still too long left in the battle though for that to stick, which is interesting. Unless Lothlorien do something miraculous, or the Orcs decide to pull back and not win the battle in this manner. And I think that is what they're going to do, based on what they're doing here. Uruk-hai Berserkers remaining for the time being. Archers still running around. Some of the elves, still a little bit of ammunition left. Even though the drummers are not great in melee. Once again, this is going to be another one of those situations where the announcer continues to announce his presence in an uncalled for manner, isn't it? Still, these drummers, not great in melee, but may as well commit them in at this point. Galathrim Axemen still utterly surrounded, although now the battle has turned against them, even with that bit of arrow support they were getting. Guard not going to be victorious all on their lonesome up there. We'll need a little bit of extra support, although surely the Orcs have enough to secure this battle in the long run now. Blackguard, which again, very good defensive stats on the Witch-Ram Blackguard. Angmar just in general, statistically, are a very strong faction, in addition to very much passing the eye test in most battles that they're in. Lothlorien archers, even the poison projectiles are not going to be enough at this stage. And indeed, the elves don't have the numbers. I think it's pretty much guaranteed at this point that the Orcs will go on to win the battle. It's probably been guaranteed for a little while. In fact, it's just how many kills Lothlorien can get on the way down. Blackguard scooting across. Heavy Goblin crossbow is going to try and get in position perhaps, and maybe position themselves just in front of Elrond's abode and try and sling a few crossbow bolts into the Galadon's Guardians. Galathrim's still doing a good job over on the other side. I mean, Guards of Orthanc, again, it's not a huge amount of forces the Orcs have left. I think when they decided to move forward in force, they had enough quality to back that up to the point where the traditional Elven advantage of quality wasn't really big enough to the point where they could turn the battle around at that point. I think the attackers as well made good use of some of their tools like the catapults, and also, well, we'll talk about that towards the tail end of the battle. I mean, it's not impossible, I suppose, that Lorien win this fight, although it would be one of the most unlikely outcomes we've seen in a while. Blackback Mountain Berserkers trying to plough their way through. If they get into close proximity, They're one of the units which can do damage quickly to an elven bodyguard. Angmar Marauders, again sending a flanking force around. I mean, I am somewhat impressed that the Misty Mountains are still fighting over here, such as it is. I mean, they are about to fall apart, but this was a fight where pretty much consistently the elves have been pretty much destined to win this battle, but everywhere else across the field they started to struggle. Lothlorien probably lingering too long with too many of their reinforcements up here when they could have been used in the town. Albeit Imladris and Lindon both made that error as well, and their reinforcements were far closer, so it was definitely a universal error from the elves. I think they just waited a little bit too long to commit reinforcements, and by the time they did, it was already too late. The orcs had the wind in their sails, and they had already committed. They took matters into their own hands, and they have been rewarded for it. Like Berserkers also making their way forward now, another high damage unit again, leveraging their numbers here. They've got Uruk-hai pikes as well, so it's not as if they're completely defenceless in that regard. Thank you for that, announcer. And it's one of those things that I keep meaning to turn him off. There is a way to do it when you go into the game files, I'm pretty sure. But every time this sort of battle rears itself, I completely forget about it by the next time it happens. Forcing their way uphill. I mean, this is maybe the best example of an attacker victory that we've seen so far in the new version of the game, because quite a few times in these battle replays, as we've seen in the new version, the defenders have come out victorious in many of them. This is maybe a little bit more akin to the last patch, although I would say some of the attacking players are maybe a little bit more fresh with the game as well, in comparison to some of the defenders, at least at the time this was ran, because this was pretty much, I think, the day after the patch released. It's just taken me a while to get around to it because it blended in terms of file name. Blackguard, who have definitely played their part, again just to make sure that these Galathrim remain honest. I think the Blackguard will probably win this fight for them, in fact, and then if that is true, the path will be cleared, even if the attackers are not able to smash their way through from the front, which I think will happen because the Carascaladon's Guardians formation is being split asunder a little bit by the guards of Orthanc burrowing their way into the Elven line. Uruk-hai continuing to try and push their way uphill as well. Further down. I mean, credit to the attackers for not simply taking the town centre, because that is one of the main disadvantages of Rivendell as a settlement, is the fact that you have to hold on to your outer defences at the main gate, basically. You have to front load over there, otherwise if you lose it, then the town centre is wide open for being claimed. Whereas over here, you've got far more of a series of positions you can fall back to should the need arise, but it was actually a trap the defenders fell into here, but the attackers, in a sporting way, decided to not take as full an advantage of it as maybe they could have done. Still doing a decent amount of damage, to be fair, the elves. I mean, many of their units are well suited for facing off against the kind of forces one-to-one that they are still battling, but there are simply too many of them. Meanwhile, the Blackguard being joined by their rank and file, the Angmar Marauders and Halberds, which will surely be enough to overwhelm the elves over here, but at the very least, it does go to show what a decent last stand Lothlorien can put on, albeit that isn't the most surprising thing in the world, of course. Still trudging uphill. Further down as well, Angmar Halberds reorganising themselves. That, I would assume, Seeing as the Lothlorien general fell earlier on,
Lost control of the castle.
I'd assume that was one of the attacking generals, skewered by those elven pikes. Plenty of these Angmar pushing their way forwards. I mean, to be fair to Angmar, it's kind of an interesting composition because no Barrow-wights, no Witches, no Blackwatch Legion. All three of probably the least popular among the community Angmar units, which they do use to devastating effect a lot. This was a far more simplistic army of just pretty much heavy infantry. And you saw how effective that can be. Very blunt instrument no matter what they bring, really, Angmar, but this was a slightly different way of deploying it, and the numbers of infantry they've been able to use in just regular combat has been one of the hallmarks of the attack of victory here. Angmar was still a bit left, although by far and away the healthiest army left on the field is going to be Isengard. Mostly Uruk-hai remaining. Saruman will take up residence in Elrond's old villa. Defeat. Now very much a certainty for the elves. They were putting a brave face on it for quite a while there. There goes the Angmar general. That is pretty wild. The fact that the Noldorin Blademaster's still alive down here, in spite of the fact that this front line for Lindon has been lost for forever and a day, really. And it goes to show when you're in this sort of situation where the engagement is narrow, very much a 300 kind of situation. And there goes the Angmar general anyway. Again, that Lindon front line, which was well constructed, if it had been better supported by skirmishers, that could well have been a little bit more efficient, and that could have made the difference here, because I mean it looks fairly substantial, but as you can see, the difference between the two sides at the end probably going to be around 6% when all is said and done. That is not limitless by any means. Any one of the engagements going slightly better for the elves, and with how quickly they can deal that damage, this battle could very, very easily have gone the other way. The attackers have done a good job, however, of sustaining their momentum over a long period of time in this battle, and that has proven to be a substantial thing. Lothlorien now routing and fleeing on all fronts. I think, well, those Noldorin Blademasters could be the last defending unit left when all is said and done. Basically, it's coming down to which of the depleted elven bodyguards with their backs to the wall can last just that little bit longer. The pikes, with their formation buckled by a troll like this, it probably shouldn't be them, but the Guardians of Kharndoon, for all I was bigging up their attack scores, they haven't been able at all to finish off these three remaining Blademasters. Again, making the battlefield narrow. I mean, there's no better example, really, of if the battlefield is narrow, quality will win out. Though in the centre of Rivendell, that's difficult for the elves to do. You've got to try and manufacture that kind of engagement across the battlefield a little bit more readily, perhaps, than the defenders were able to do on this occasion. And yeah, Lindon are going to be the last ones left standing, which is pretty wild. I think now, surely, the green light to attack and take the town centre. It's fair game. Oh no, the Lothlorien nobles are still here. They managed to slip away from the Blackguard in the end, trying to kill off these crossbows in as higher quantities as they possibly can. Of course, the crossbows are dreadful in melee, so easy prey indeed. And no, these Eldarinway spears wouldn't have been enough to make the difference, so in the end, Imladris, admitting defeat earlier, wasn't really too much of a factor. They would have broken through that area pretty quickly after that anyway. But still, it would have been enough for a few extra kills, perhaps. Bring that margin just that little bit closer. Having said that, these guys are showing no signs whatsoever of falling down dead just yet. Will they be able to outlast? Well, possibly, actually, because now with the Uruk-hai Berserkers on station, the Lothlorien nobles will probably fall away pretty quickly. Also, the stand and shoot of the heavy goblin crossbows, trying to fire those bolts at point blank range. Oh no, they're just padding their kill count a little bit. Going after the unmoving Eldarenway spearmen. Only killing 2 off though. Calathrun nobles finished off.
The enemy is no longer in command.
Resuming their conquest of the TC. On this occasion though, the battle will end before the town centre is ultimately completely conquered. The bloodied Guardians of Khan Doom still there. And I mean, 2 of the Temple Guard left. Well, that was the general actually, so he doesn't have a bow. Still 3 remain. The last stand continues. As the rain also continues to pour down on Rivendell.
Very much in our favour. Victory will be ours.
I mean, surely, are they all going to fall away quickly? I don't know what it was about that spot, but the Guardians of Khan Doom were just not able to deal damage. They will be able to now, because they'll be able to turn back around and surround the Lothlorien Blade Masters. One of the troll catapults is also on the way here, but it goes to show as well the shape of an engagement. That is pretty much the ultimate example of how important that can be. The Lindon general killed just outside the TC as well. As it was, it didn't look like those Guardians of Khan Doom would ever kill those Lothlorien Blade Masters, but now that it's been opened up a little bit, they'll be able to rain blows down with greater impunity. So just little examples really of the game's mechanics at work, working as intended. And there we have it. The battle reaches its conclusion. The Orcs do win. 7% the difference in the end, which I think is fair. I think the attackers have been worthy victors of this battle in the end. I think the defenders, again, just nothing too bad. I think the committal of reinforcements too far away, lagging behind, being a little bit too slow. You know, seeing, you know, when the attackers move forward, I mean, you can't really camouflage a mass advance from the Orcs like that. So as soon as you see that happening, you need to react to it. Otherwise, especially on a settlement like this, it can be very, very difficult to reverse that kind of momentum, especially when you consider the kind of numbers discrepancy that the defenders were working with. But good damage still done. You know, huge amount of damage done by Lothlorien, of course, because they were active for the longest and had the most advantageous engagements, shall we say. Lindon and Imladris having to go, you know, on that front line. Lindon struggling a little bit early on to maybe get their positioning right. Imladris, reinforcements a little bit too far away, like we said. Use of skirmishers as well. I mean, initially I was actually being fairly critical of their liberal use of the skirmishers, but in the end, as soon as they really needed them the most, they started to sort of pull them back a little bit and not use them as much as they needed to reverse the tide. So all of those little factors together added up to them not really being able to get back into the game properly. I mean, they were able to keep it competitive, you know, in terms of kill counts for a long time, but ultimately never able to start earning back the deficit that they were in, only maintaining. And I think the attackers played their part in that as well. I mean, they moved forward aggressively, you know, they used their supporting units well, they knew when to be patient early on, you know, gain a bit of that value and then move forward in earnest, positioning their artillery well to do heavy damage to Lindon, which ultimately ended up being probably the deciding factor in the fight, because if they had to go up against that Lindon front line without any sort of support being put onto it, the damage they would have done to the Mordor and Angmar assault probably would have been fairly terminal, considering the kind of margins we're talking about here. So yeah, that was also a key moment. Good visualization of the field by the attackers, and yeah, I think the right call was made. The Misty Mountains, probably the single faction on the battlefield that struggled the most, but that was mostly by design. I think they marched into the meat grinder willingly to keep Lothlorien occupied. The Blackback Mountain Berserkers still did a good amount of damage as they were part of the general advance over here. Much of the rest of the army outside. The Drake Broodlings weren't as devastating as they can be. The Trolls, where are the Trolls? Cave Trolls and Snow Trolls doing nicely again as part of that huge Troll advance early, which again was one of those moments of, you know, gaining and seizing the momentum that the attackers used. A lot of the rest of the forces, however, were fed into the Lothlorien meat grinder really, but again, that was with a purpose. And yeah, I think as much as it probably won't be a terribly popular victory, the Orcs managing to defeat an all-elven defence of Rivendell, it was the right outcome in the end. 4,000 strong army from Angmar as well. It goes to show how big Angmar's army can get when they really focus on that as a priority. So yeah, big thank you to Colonel Speaks 46 for sending this in. Big thanks to all the players as well for being a part of this battle replay. Sorry it took so long to get round to it, but I just completely blanked it. There was another Rivendell replay that I got sent as well, which was nowhere near as close. The defenders did win, but it was an absolute curb stomping, and it wasn't really a particularly entertaining. It wasn't competitive enough to show. I won't say it wasn't entertaining in its own right, but it wasn't competitive enough to show. Whereas this one was, and it was sent to me before. It just blended into the background. But I'm glad that I managed to catch it, because it is on one of the set piece maps that was redesigned for this version of the game, and one of the first to be so as well. So hopefully we will continue to see these as the weeks go by. As far as what's going to be coming up next, I mean, this is pretty much me coming to the end of my backlog of replays that I've shown that are A, suitable, I think, for showing on the channel, and B, not a duplicate of a map that I've shown extremely recently. So that's really, so there are a couple of, like, there was one that Winged Swordsman sent me that I can't really show because it was on a replay that I've done, on this side of the new patch, which is too close, really. So yeah, we'll see. I mean, I am fairly far ahead. I'm like a little over a month, I think, ahead of where these are actually releasing now. So we'll see what happens in the interim. I can't really see that far ahead. One thing I can maintain, however, is the fact that the faction overviews will be continuing. Each Wednesday, one of those will be coming out, unless there's some other news, like maybe I think there's a Silmarillion showcase that I'm going to be doing at some point, which probably will be a weekend slot, honestly, but could be midweek. There is also a bit of hotfix news, which by the time this one comes out may have already even been shown. I'm not sure. Again, because of how far ahead of time that I'm recording these now, it's kind of hard to say, but things will continue to chug along as they have done ever since the new patch released, as we make our way towards the end of the year. And the channel update at the end of the year will be a bit of a reorganisation one, really, and I haven't fully decided what I'm going to be doing yet, but yeah, that will be an important one. But again, enough of my waffling. I always tend to do that at the end of these lately. So big thank you to Colonel Speaks 46 once again. Big thank you to all the players. Hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.